As part of the introduction to this course and finale, it just makes sense to go back and look at the history of printing music, and that's what we're going to do, just visiting some of the most significant developments in that history. And I can think of no better place to start than with Guido d'Arezzo. Guido was born around 1000 in France and was a Benedictine monk. But in some time he became the choir master in Arezzo, an Italian town, and that's obviously why his name has that association. The challenge of his job and of all the choir masters of that day was teaching the men and boys in their choirs probably what were hundreds of service music for the Mass throughout the Catholic Church year. And they relied on rote to do this, although words and even some rhythmic indications in jottings in pens called neumes were used. They were very general, and there was a lot of openness to interpretation. So the church was very concerned that everybody would learn to sing them uniformly, and Guido solved that around 1025 by developing a system of neumes on either 2 or 3 or 4 lines staff, which aided the singers in knowing what the pitches were. And the neumes, the more developed they got, they indicated the rhythm more exactly. So it turned out that he was very popular. He was celebrated for having done that. Pope John the 19th brought him to Rome in 1028 to demonstrate his technique. How is it that he could teach his choir so many songs so fast and so accurately? Well, it was because of this advance in music notation. Here's an example of a 4-line staff with neumes on it. Now this is later, this is 1370, Italian illuminated manuscript, and you can see illuminated meaning that the letter O in omine there is basically developed into a painting of its own. And so it's very pretty to look at manuscript, and this is all done by hand by copyists, by monks in monasteries and so forth. Let's just listen to this music for just a bit. Notice that there are no bar lines also on this music. The first printed music, according to the New Grove Dictionary of Music, was in 1457, a volume called Codex Spalmorum, and interestingly the text was printed, but the music, it was actually, there was space left for the music to be added manually. So here we still don't have music being printed from a press, but rather by hand. Here's another example of neumes on staff, but here it's a 5-line staff in around 1500 in Spain. Still no bar lines, but you can see the neumes are getting more uniform looking and simpler actually, and they're starting to resemble the containers that we call note heads now. And then here in France, a French manuscript in 1625, although we're back to the 4-line staff, obviously the 5-line staff had not become standardized yet, but there's something that looks like a clef at the beginning of each line, and also notice there are bar lines now. So meter is something that's metrical groupings are something that's being thought of. Now this is an example of woodcut printing, an Italian example from almost 1500, around the same time as that last example. This is kind of like something I did in middle school art class. We called it block printing, where we'd have a linoleum block that we'd carve out with a knife or with some kind of a carving tool, and then take a roller, roll the ink across it, and then put it up against a piece of paper, press on it, and you'd have your sort of a reverse printing technique. Notice the word tenor and cantus on the left side, and here's the block of wood where the words tenor and cantus are in reverse on the right side. So everything had to be carved out in reverse for this kind of a process. Everybody knows about the development of the movable type. In other words, that letters could be moved in and out of the printing press that Johannes Gutenberg, a German, invented around 1440, and that led to things like this, the movable type music printing. Petrucci is the name of the font in the program Finale, or at least it used to be the name of the font in some of the earlier versions of Finale, and that's where they came up with that name for that font. It's from the printer. And in this process, there'd have to be several consecutive impressions where the first printing would be the staves, and then the second printing, the notes would be added, and the third printing, perhaps the words would be added. But Petrucci is credited with producing the first book of sheet music on a movable type printing press like this. And if you line up some of the most famous composers of the Renaissance, like Josquin des Prez, there's a reason probably why his music was more widely disseminated, not just because he was a great composer, but also he had technology on his side. This is also the same technology that the Psalm book, the Genevan Psalter, would have been printed on. The Psalter is very famous in the history of the church. English separatists and non-separatists, who basically were the Pilgrims and the Puritans, would have had this in their hymn books. And actually, the hymn you're looking at is Old 100th. Bum 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 bum. Bum 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 bum. Called 100th because it was a setting of the 100th psalm, and that's what a psalter was. They were metrical settings of psalms. Now, just to revisit the idea of neumes, they're actually still used even today, rarely today, but the book Liber Usualis is basically settings of the regular chants that would be sung in a Catholic Mass service. And as this example indicates, even into the 20th century, the Liber Usualis was published on a 4-line staff to look like the neumes of old. So even though it's a lost art in a sense, they're still around in some form through the church. Well, the next significant development in music printing was the development of the lithography, or the lithograph. Alois Sennenfelder, a Bavarian actually actor and playwright, turns out, invented this technique for practical reasons. Well, let's just first say that lithography is drawing on a limestone, a special limestone with greasy ink or crayon pen. And because grease repels water, the stone would be treated and washed with a number of chemicals, and it would cause the ink to apply to the paper when it was printed, but water to wash the area that you didn't want to apply to the paper. So the chemicals caused it to adhere, the ink to adhere where it's supposed to, but not to adhere and actually be washed off where it wasn't supposed to. What is interesting is that what led to this development was that Sennenfelder was a playwright, and just basically was broke and couldn't reproduce his plays. I guess he had a successful play or two, and then had some that he had written and wanted to reproduce, and it just was too expensive to print. So he actually developed this just as a cheaper way for him to produce his dramatic scripts. He ended up patenting it, and it was used all over Europe. Here's an example where the technology advanced so that a composer like Richard Wagner, he wrote his score for Tannhäuser using a special paper and ink, which then the paper written on with a special ink could then be applied to a lithography plate or stone. And so this would be, say, a more, as the technology progressed, where lithography in music printing led. And so this is some of Tannhäuser that we're listening to as we look at this autograph score by Wagner. Notice also that on the autograph score, probably the paper already had the staves on it. Notice that earlier woodcut and some of the other earlier techniques, the staves were part of what was carved, whereas here, Wagner would have had the staves already on the paper and just used his pen. We get into the 20th century, and metal engraving is king for a long time. Metal plates that would have been actually carved would be made of copper or zinc or pewter. And you can see that in the picture on the left, there's actually a scoring tool that has 5 burrs on it that is then with a ruler scraped across the plate, and it scores the 5 lines. In fact, that is probably, I believe, where the term score comes from, is that he's scoring the plate. And then fixed symbols like clefs and note heads, things that were uniform and could be repeated, were hammered into the plate. If there was a mistake, you'd have to hammer it back out, and in the end, these burrs, these little rasps or whatever, had to be cleaned off, and the plate had to be polished so that it could ink could be applied and it could be used. So metal engraving is actually, where we use the term that music is engraved, it comes from this actual practice, and really an art. This is an example of a score that, or a piece of music that would have been put through that process. This is Alexander Arjunian's Trumpet Concerto. We'll visit this music a little bit later on. But let's just take a little detour, because this is a professional level type of music production, or at least the most permanent professional level reproduction. But at the same time as that was happening, more expedient types of music would have been done with an ink pen on vellum paper, for instance, and that was able to be reproduced the same way, for instance, draftsmen and architects would reproduce blueprints with an oscilloid process, where the paper is translucent. Light can shine through it, so the ink is not translucent, and when you write in pen on that kind of vellum paper, then you can place that vellum paper up against a type of a film that has what is called a diazo compound. Ultraviolet light is exposed to the film, and then later it's developed with an ammonia vapor, and you get what those of us who are old enough to have read the old Broadway books, that's the way that music looked. What you're looking at actually is a piece of music I wrote for my wife in 1988 as a Christmas present. It was a series of 5 Christmas carols that I set sort of in a contemporary fashion and gave it to her as a Christmas gift, and it turns out it was my first published piece of music. But when I actually presented it to Kim, my wife, the music was in this ink with a metal nib pen, using that special ink on vellum paper. And then at the Free Library of Philadelphia, 19th and Vine Street in Philadelphia, I believe they still even do this. They were the only place I could find that would reproduce music that way. But I feel very fortunate to have sort of come up in a time when they were still doing music that way, even though we were just about on the advent of computer music software like Finale. So here's a close-up example of that. I had to do this by hand, and you can see I didn't even use a ruler for the beams in the music, or any kind of special help for the slurs. Those are all freehand, and even the flags and things like that, the numbers. I did use a ruler, by the way, for the bar lines. Anyway, this is that piece when it was first published. This is the publisher used a program called Score, and now we're into sort of the age of computer music notation. However, Score would have been a program where, as we'll talk about this a little bit more, where it was before the operating systems that we're used to using today. The music would have been described in code and text, not in a graphic way like we do today, where we actually click notes on a staff in a program. But anyway, you can see it's a really nice product. The imprint that the publisher used, was able to achieve using Score, is quite fine. And so, a moment ago, you saw the ink on vellum manuscript that I wrote in '88, and then this is a couple of years later, I guess, or a year later, when it was published, what it would have looked like with the program Score. Leland Smith is the fellow who developed Score. He was a Stanford University professor. He developed it as an outgrowth of work that he did at IRCAM, that famous music technology facility in Paris. He did this in the late 1970s. And you can see an actual example of some music, and then below it, the code. There are sort of 5 stages, first the pitches, then the rhythm, then the things like the beams and slurs. All of that had to be coded in, and it's not as intuitive as it would seem, but I'm sure a lot of big publishers used it. It was the standard for a while. So it's quite expressive, but for those of us who aren't used to it, it does look kind of counterintuitive. And it ran on disk operating system most recently. It may even, I'm not sure, but it may even run on more current operating systems. And then with personal computers, and especially with the development of graphic user interfaces that give us icons and tools and things like desktops and things about the system that make the interface more intuitive and less textual. And also with the development of MIDI, we end up with programs like Finale and Sibelius. So we're basically now up to the computer music technology. Finale was developed around 1988. MIDI was developed by the consortium of keyboard manufacturers like Korg and Roland and so forth in around 1984. So Finale was only about 4 years behind MIDI, and I think that was basically the last major thing that had to happen for things like Finale and Sibelius to be possible. Anyway, let's look at one score that I wrote actually originally in pencil, and that's the one kind of music printing that we haven't talked about. Composers like Beethoven we know use pencils to write their music, and earlier, and I was still doing that when I wrote this piece, Aesop's Fables. In fact, it was I know this for a fact because my editor at Alfred told me this. Bob Sheldon is the man's name. He told me when they accepted this score that it was the last pencil score that they accepted at Alfred. After publishing this piece, they basically made a decision that they would only accept scores that were created in either Finale or Sibelius. In other words, that were professional looking, musically typeset. So I don't know if that's an honor or a curse that I have that honor, but that was in 2005. Here is the pencil manuscript for Aesop's Fables, or at least the opening page of it, and you can see, I tried to be neat, but yet it doesn't look as nice as when it's typeset in Finale. And of course, here is the Finale version of it, and we'll just listen to a little bit of it. Now, I want to mention too that when composers do turn in their scores to publishers like Alfred Music, which published this one, Alfred Publications, the typesetters, the professional music copyists at Alfred, they start from scratch. They don't take the MIDI file, or at least they generally don't take the MIDI file from the composer and just clean it up. Their templates and their what makes the publisher's music look like it looks, or that's what's an imprint. That's called an imprint. What makes an imprint look like it does has a lot to do with all of their conventions and standards that are unique to that publisher. So they basically use your Finale notated music as a hard copy, and then they start all over again from scratch, and then a lot of proofreading has to be done, of course. But it is easier to type it in if it looks like the Finale version rather than the pencil version you saw. And so, from medieval copying by hand to 21st century computer music notation programs like Finale, we can learn much by examining how music is documented. Could it be that the medium influences the music? Were the free, elastic rhythms of Gregorian chant influenced by the lack of rhythmic precision of early music notation? Finale is a powerful tool, but it has its own limitations. If you are composing today with Finale, could there be some limitation of the program which shapes the way you allow yourself to think about the music you write?